Joining me now from Nairobi is Irungu Houghton. He is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya, and also from Nairobi, Peter Ngau. He is the urban planner behind the highway project and an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Nairobi. Thanks both so much for joining us. Irungu, I'd like to start with you. In this case, is the government foregoing the interest and well-being of its most vulnerable people really just in favor of development, or does this highway better serve the greater good?
I mean, I think from our perspective as Amnesty International, we were very concerned with the way that the evictions were carried out last week. They have all the traits of a forced eviction. The process was initiated and at the negotiation of the community and the Kenyan National Commission for Human Rights, there was an agreement to do an enumeration process to list all the persons that would be affected by this project. And that process began in earnest. But unfortunately, before the Kenya Urban Roads Authority could come back to the community and the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights, the bulldozers rolled into Kibera, and 3 days later, we had 2,000 households essentially smashed to the ground, with about 10,000 people basically homeless. It knocked down at least 5 schools and damaged 2 other schools, several community health centers, and also a number of religious places of worship. So in very many ways, this was a very bad example of how to remove people from a road reserve in order to build or to upgrade a road.
Peter, let me ask you, was there a better way for the government to go about this?
The road was planned in 1970s. The area which was demolished was a road reserve. I would say that during the 80s and 90s, people settled on that area, that's the Kibera slums. And of course, the idea was, like Irungu said, there should have been a negotiated way of getting the people notice and giving them an alternative site so that they settle, so that the road can be done. The road is a legal project, and I think it has been mentioned already. The representatives of the community and the road authority and the National Land Commission met. I understand a enumeration was carried out between 16th and 20th, and agreement was expected to come. Whether the agency moved fast before settling the people, that is something which I think has not been clarified.
Okay, then let me ask Irungu. I mean, the government says that it followed the necessary court process. So where is the disconnect here? I mean, how can you have families suddenly woken up in the early hours of the morning to hear bulldozers outside and having to run out of their homes and watch their neighborhood be demolished if the government says it followed processes necessarily?
I'm not sure which processes and which laws they would be referring to, but in Kenya we have essentially one law, which is the Internally Displaced Persons Act of 2012. We also have guidelines on legal evictions. We are also signatories to very many international human rights instruments. And as far as we can see, and I was in Kibera as the bulldozers knocked down several homes, none of that was followed. In that moment, we essentially saw very expensive tippers, excavators and bulldozers, and about 600 police officers, but no single education officer, no single councillor, no single housing officer providing alternative information on where people could go for housing, or where the children that were now no longer able to go to their schools, where they would be relocated to. So in many ways, I think there are many lessons that the government must learn from the Kibera experience. Kibera is one of our oldest and probably most famous urban settlements. It is essentially a catchment area for a lot of urban-rural migration, as Peter has said. And although the road reserve was essentially set aside in the 70s, the absence of government infrastructure or modernization of that area has seen a lot of encroachment by communities. And it's not one of the only suburbs with this problem. There are many neighborhoods that are currently living, I think something like 60% of the population of Nairobi live on similar circumstances as we have in Kibra.
I mean, Peter, do you think there is an issue here when it comes down to those final moments, and we accept that there are so many thousands of people living in so-called illegal settlements, that the government just ends up running roughshod over the rights of its most vulnerable citizens?
I would say that first to comment the civil society groups like Kenya National Commission of Human Rights and Amnesty International, because in fact they did intervene. On 10th, they called for a meeting, and the meeting involved the road authority, and that's why the idea of enumeration and the resettlement was discussed. So I think that first of all, it averted worse scenario. In terms of this area, the road is meant to benefit the larger Nairobi, but I believe also with the support of the civil society, they can also look at how this road will benefit the neighborhood. We need to understand that in an informal settlement, about 90% of the people living there are actually tenants. And the structures belong to a very small percentage of landlords. Now, when the discussion with the National Land Commission was going on, the National Land Commission made it very clear that they would only compensate the structure owners, not the tenants. So I think, again, it needs to be clarified. This is different from a rural setting. It's an urban setting where we have tenants and we have structure owners.
Okay, Peter, let me put this to you, though, because there has been a lot of criticism that the government prefers to build highways that tend to benefit the wealthier people that own cars and private transport, rather than investing in the public transport that could equally benefit everyone, but not so much private investment and the already wealthy members of Kenyan society. What do you make of that?
To an extent, yes, much of the road building in Nairobi has focused on the motorized vehicle, side of the transport. We are beginning to see discussions in planning talking about mass transport or mass road transport, which will be very useful. The other thing, of course, is in the design of the plans, we need more stakeholders to play a part, because you find a road is passing through a neighborhood, and there is very little even interlinkage of the local roads. That needs to be improved. And I think I can say that, the city is just growing. It is not a very old city, but we need to improve on how we do some of these infrastructure projects.
Irungu, is that true? Is a lack of good urban planning a major part of the problem here?
I mean, Peter Ngau is one of our foremost urban planners in this country. He knows this better than I do, but we have a number of plans that just don't get implemented. We have a lot of bylaws that don't get enforced. So much of the problem, like everywhere else in the world, essentially is not the shortage of ideas. It's really the shortage of political will to implement them. And I think from Amnesty, we would basically argue that whether it be gentrification, whether it be modernization, or whether it be large infrastructure projects, they have to benefit the large mass of people that are below the poverty line. Because if you don't do that, you are essentially just displacing slums, or as I prefer to call them, urban neighborhoods that have no security of tenure. So I think that, for me, is the way forward, is essentially dialogue, public participation, and consultation, and also a commitment that you are not going to displace communities. That has no place in a democratic society. I think, walking in Kibra in the last week or so, I was asked several times by the Kibran residents, are we children, are we Kenyans of a lesser God? And I had no answer, except to say that they have rights like all of us.
I mean, Peter, that is really the question here. How can urban planners like yourself start accommodating the country's millions of poor and homeless residents? They can't just be wished away and constantly displaced. They need to be somewhere, and planning needs to be done around where they need to reside.
I would say that the government as of late, has started paying great attention to people of low income housing. We have what now in Kenya we call the Big Four. One of them is affordable housing. And there are efforts by government to really pay attention to this segment of society. It has been an economic challenge because as the country has developed, urbanization has moved faster than the way the country would provide jobs, would provide housing. This is a tragedy of rapid urbanization which is taking place. And I think the efforts by the government, which we are now seeing, with the, of course, support of other partners, civil society groups, I expect things will improve in the coming years. We have had some models of housing which have not been very successful. We have had government housing projects which have largely gone to the middle class. And I believe that in the planning of affordable housing in the new era now, some of these mistakes are going to be looked at.
Okay, but let me ask if these mistakes can really make or break the country, because Irungu, the truth is, Peter described them just there as segments of society. They're not really segments of society. These are huge, huge populations that are actually equivalent to the populations of major cities. This is urgent.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've been talking about Nairobi for the last few minutes, but I think the lessons need to be learned for the other 47 capitals of our counties. And if we don't get it right in Nairobi, which has, yes, the biggest population, a population of upwards of 4 to 5 million people, we are likely to export this inhumane practice to various other cities. I think this morning I saw a number of the Kibra residents and residents from at least 10 other settlements rush to court to try and file an injunction over what looks like could be another 10 evictions over the next 2 weeks. And I think for those of us in civil society, and particularly as Amnesty International, we are calling on the government to stop, to basically announce a moratorium on forced evictions, to allow communities to be enumerated, to set up resettlement action plans, and allow people to relocate to other places rather than simply the destruction and the state violence that we have seen. Just one last image perhaps for your viewers, and that is the image of this space where there used to be 2,000 households. To the left of that space, there is a golf course where you have maybe 5 or 6 people playing golf on a landmass that is maybe 10, 15 times bigger than the road reserve that was taken on last week.
Peter, there had been complaints about that instead of building across the golf course that so few people are able to afford and enjoy, the planners chose to build a highway across the residences of thousands of people.
As I've said, this road was reserved in 1970s. It's part of Nairobi's system of roads to make mobility better in Nairobi. Nairobi experiences extremely, big traffic jams, and it's all because everybody has to converge to the CBD to go everywhere. And now the idea of ring roads, the idea of bypasses, I think one cannot really quarrel with that one. The question is, of course, this idea of evictions. Nobody really supports evictions. And I think, actually, to the credit of civil society, from 2000, government has not been carrying out evictions or demolition of slums, except when there is a road to be done. So the current engagement between civil society and road agencies on how to go about it, I think guided by the law, which is the Internally Displaced People's Act, it should be the one which we should follow.
Okay, Irungu, let me finish with this. Do you fear, actually, on the global scale, that the plight of these people will actually just be forgotten? Because this is a global issue, and in countless countries now, we are seeing the further and further marginalization of the world's desperately poor.
I would like to be optimistic and hope that those in government would really reach out. And, you know, just to give you an example, 2 days after we held a press conference to condemn the forced evictions, the Education Ministry announced that they would look for alternative schooling for the children, the 2,500 children who were displaced. But there was no way to find them because essentially they hadn't bothered, no government agency had bothered to be able to list where the children were, which schools they went to, what ages they were, and what classes they were going to. And therefore what we have essentially is a knee-jerk response to what is, I think, a moral question. But no ability to be able to manage that. So in the case of the 10 neighborhoods that are about to be bulldozed in the next 2 weeks, one of the things we would be calling upon the state to do is to do its due diligence, to actually go in, enumerate or list the persons to be affected by the project and have the conversation with them about relocation. I think the worst that a democratic society should experience is really involuntary relocation. That is where you are relocated against your will, but at least you are given an option. The concept of forced eviction is not a concept that a democratic society can uphold.
Okay, Irungu, I will have to give you the last word because unfortunately we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you and Peter so much for joining us there from Nairobi.